Most of us think bread is simple. Flour, water, yeast, salt. That's the mental picture. But when I started turning over some of Britain's most popular loaves, I kept seeing something very different on the back. Preservatives, emulsifiers, oils, soya flour, flour treatment agents. And the more brands I checked, the clearer the pattern became. This is important, so let me be clear from the start. I'm not saying supermarket bread is poison. I'm not saying these brands are breaking the law. And I'm not saying every additive on a bread label is dangerous. What I am saying is this. The front of the packet often sells you a feeling. Heritage, freshness, simplicity, tradition. The back of the packet often tells a much more industrial story. And once you see that gap, it's very hard to unsee.
Today, we're going through Britain's biggest bread brands. We're looking at what's actually in them, and by the end, I'm going to tell you which mainstream loaves come out best and which ones rely most heavily on the industrial bread playbook. And one of the most interesting findings is this. Some of the brands that feel the most traditional are not necessarily the simplest. Today, we're turning the loaf around.
Before we get into the brands, here's the one official stat that made me stop. In the Food Standards Agency's 2024 to 25 Retail Surveillance Sampling Programme, bread had the lowest compliance rate of the categories tested. Only 9 out of 35 bread samples were judged satisfactory. That's 26%. Now, to be fair, this was mainly about labelling and undeclared allergen issues, not banned chemicals secretly hiding in your loaf. But that still matters, because bread is not some niche health food product. It is one of the most ordinary foods in Britain. Kids eat it, families eat it, older people eat it. It goes in lunchboxes, toasters, sandwiches, freezer drawers, every single week. So if the regulator tests a batch of bread products and only 9 out of 35 come back satisfactory, that should at least make us ask one question. Why are we so relaxed about this aisle? And once I started asking that, I realised this video isn't really just about one brand. It's about the fact that bread has become so normal, so routine, so automatic, that most of us stopped checking what we were actually buying. Let's start with the picture most of us carry in our heads. When people think of bread, proper bread, they usually imagine something simple: flour, water, yeast or starter, salt. That's not a silly assumption. That's bread in its most basic form. But a lot of wrapped supermarket bread is not built around that ideal. It's built around something else: speed, softness, shelf life, consistency, transport, and scale. And when bread is built for all of that, the ingredient list usually gets longer. So instead of just flour, water, yeast and salt, you start seeing things like vegetable oils, soya flour, calcium propionate, emulsifiers like E471, E472e and E481, ascorbic acid. That doesn't automatically mean the bread is unsafe, but it does mean something important.
It means you're not just looking at a traditional loaf, you're looking at an industrially formulated product. That phrase can sound dramatic, but it really just means this. The loaf has been engineered to stay soft, resist mold, survive distribution, and look and feel the same every time you buy it. That's commercially efficient, but it is not the same thing as simple bread. Before we get into the brands, there are 4 ingredients you should recognize, not fear. Recognize, because once you know what they do, the whole aisle starts to make more sense.
Calcium propionate, E472. This is a preservative. Its job is simple: slow down mold. That's why so many soft wrapped breads can sit on a shelf, then on your counter, and still stay looking fresh for longer. It's common, it's legal, it's widely used. The point here isn't panic, the point is awareness. A lot of Britain's most everyday bread relies on a mold inhibitor, and most shoppers probably never think about that. E471, mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. This is an emulsifier. In plain English, it helps factory bread stay soft, uniform and stable. This one has drawn more scientific attention in recent years, but it's important not to overstate that. Observational studies can show patterns. They do not prove that one ingredient directly caused one disease. So if anyone online tells you this ingredient definitely causes cancer, that is not an honest reading of the evidence. The honest version is this. E471 is legal. It is still widely allowed, but it is one of the additives that now gets more scrutiny than it used to. That's worth knowing. E472e. Datum. This is another emulsifier. Its job is dough strength, loaf volume and softness. If you want mass-produced bread to rise reliably, slice neatly and stay pillowy, this kind of additive helps make that happen. Again, legal. Again, widely used. Again, not exactly what most people picture when they hear words like traditional or rustic. E481, sodium stearoyl 2 lactylate. Another emulsifier. Another texture and structure tool. Same pattern. Legal, functional, industrial. And one quick reality check. Ascorbic acid, E300. This sounds chemical. It's vitamin C. In bread, it's used as a flour treatment agent to strengthen dough. So if you're going to be annoyed about something in bread, don't waste all your energy on E300. The bigger story is the overall pattern. When a loaf contains a preservative, multiple emulsifiers, oils, soya flour and treatment agents, it stops looking like a simple recipe and starts looking like a system. And that's the key to this whole investigation. Not one ingredient, the pattern. So when I went through these brands, I wasn't asking, is this bread illegal? That's too basic. I was asking 4 better questions. 1. How big is the gap between the front of the packet and the back? 2. Which brands lean hardest on industrial formulation? 3. Which brands market themselves as cleaner, simpler or more traditional? And does the ingredient list support that? And 4. If you want a better mainstream option, where should you actually look? And that brings us to the brands. Let's start with the biggest name in the aisle, Warburtons. Orange bag, massive recognition, family business, founded in 1876. That heritage is real, and that's important because this video is not about pretending every brand story is fake. Warburtons does have genuine history, but heritage and simplicity are not the same thing. Because when you look at actual mainstream Warburtons ingredient lists, you often see the familiar industrial toolkit: oils, gluten, soya flour, emulsifiers, calcium propionate, ascorbic acid. So here's the Warburtons issue in one line. The family story is real, the ingredient list is still industrial. Both things can be true. That's why this brand is such a good example of the central gap in the bread oil. The front gives you warmth, the back gives you formulation. Verdict: trusted, familiar, genuinely heritage-led, but many mainstream loaves are much more engineered than shoppers probably assume. Hovis, tradition on the front, factory logic on the back. Hovis is maybe the strongest example of emotional bread marketing in the whole aisle. The brand is soaked in nostalgia, Britishness, tradition, familiarity, warmth. And that's exactly why the back of the packet matters so much here. Because when you turn over products like Hovis Soft White, the formula looks very modern. Preservative, multiple emulsifiers, soya flour, oil, treatment agents. So again, we get the same split. Traditional image, industrial build. Hovis is especially interesting because marketing words like rustic, authentic, traditional and artisanal inspired have already drawn scrutiny. And that gets right to the heart of the issue, because the legal question is one thing, but the everyday consumer question is another. If a shopper sees rustic on a bread bag, are they thinking about emulsifier systems and mold inhibitors? Of course not. They're picturing something closer to a bakery loaf. That's the tension. Verdict: one of the strongest examples of a brand whose emotional identity feels older and simpler than the ingredient list really is. Kingsmill. Less romance, same system. Kingsmill is different. It doesn't lean quite as hard into old-fashioned bakery romance. It feels more direct, more practical, more lunchbox, more everyday family loaf.
And in a strange way, that almost makes it feel more honest. But once you get to the ingredients, the system underneath is still very familiar. Flour blend, oils, soya flour, emulsifier, preservative, treatment agent. So while Kingsmill may market itself in a less nostalgic way than Hovis, the formulation still belongs firmly to the industrial bread world. That makes Kingsmill a useful reminder. You do not need heritage language to end up with a highly processed loaf. Verdict: not the most romantic brand in the aisle, but still a textbook factory bread formula.
Roberts is a great example of something that a lot of shoppers do without realising. They see a regional brand, a longer history, a less flashy identity, and they assume the bread must be simpler. But that assumption doesn't really hold up once you read the label, because with Roberts, you still run into the same familiar pattern: preservatives, emulsifiers, oil, treatment agents. So the honest point here is simple. A local feeling brand is not automatically a simpler brand. Since 1887 is not an ingredient. Family Bakery is not an ingredient. Northern Roots is not an ingredient. The ingredient list is the ingredient list. So verdict: heritage-led image, but very much part of the same industrial loaf ecosystem. So by this point, you can probably see the pattern. Different colours, different brand stories, different emotional language. But when you turn the packet over, a lot of the aisle starts looking surprisingly similar. And that's where the story gets more interesting. Because not every brand lands in exactly the same place. Some are really trying to position themselves as cleaner. Some use claims that sound stronger than they really are. And one brand in particular has benefited massively from the fact that shoppers are finally paying attention to ingredient lists.
Jackson's, better but still don't switch off your brain. Jackson's of Yorkshire is one of the more interesting brands here because compared with the major mainstream sliced loaves, it does make a more deliberate effort to sound cleaner. Claims like no artificial preservatives, palm oil free, dairy and soya free, vegetarian and vegan friendly. That does matter. But this is where shoppers have to be careful. Because no artificial preservatives does not mean no additives. Those are completely different claims. A loaf can contain emulsifiers and still legally say no artificial preservatives. And that is exactly the kind of wording gap that catches people out. So I describe Jackson's like this. Better positioned than the standard giants, but still not a brand you should buy on autopilot. It may be better than average, that does not automatically mean simple. It is one of the better mainstream directions in the aisle, but still a label you need to read properly.
There's another trap here. A lot of people focus on Warburtons, Hovis and Kingsmill because they're the famous names. But supermarket own label bread matters enormously. And this is where language gets slippery fast. Let's take freshly baked. To most shoppers, that phrase suggests one thing: made here, today, in this store. But in practice, supermarket bakery bread can involve products that were made elsewhere, part baked, frozen, transported, then finished in store. That means freshly baked can sometimes be doing a lot more emotional work than factual work. And once again, that is the pattern we keep running into in this aisle. The wording is not always false, but it often encourages a much simpler picture than the reality. So whether you're in the packaged bread section or the in-store bakery area, the basic rule stays the same. Don't buy the story until you've checked the details.
Now let's talk about one of the most powerful words in modern bread marketing: sourdough. Because sourdough now does a huge amount of work on supermarket shelves. It signals better quality, slower process, more authentic bread, less processing, maybe even better health. But that word can cover a lot of very different products. Some loaves use genuine long fermentation. Some use fermented flour alongside commercial yeast. Some aim for a sourdough-style image without matching what most people imagine when they hear the word. So here's the rule. If a loaf says sourdough on the front,
Do not stop there. Turn it over. Look for a short ingredient list. Look for flour, water, sunt, starter or fermented flour. And be cautious if you find commercial yeast, acids, flavorings, preservatives, emulsifiers, a long, highly managed ingredient list. And one more thing. Please don't turn sourdough into a magic health word. It may be a better option, but sourdough is not a free pass. It is not automatically a gut health miracle, and it is not automatically unprocessed. The back of the pack still decides the story.
The brand that changed the aisle. Jason's Sourdough, the disruptor. If there's one brand that explains where this market is going, it's Jason's. Because Jason's didn't win by out-nostalgiaing the old names, it won by making the ingredient list look simpler. That's the key. Compared with many standard supermarket loaves, Jason's comes across very differently. Short ingredient list, no added preservatives, no additives, no added yeast. That is a meaningful difference. Now, let's be balanced. This is still a supermarket product. It is still made at scale, and you shouldn't treat it like some magical cure-all. But if the question is, which mainstream supermarket loaf looks closest to actual bread rather than industrial bread engineering, Jason's comes out strongly. And that matters, because it tells us something bigger than one brand. It tells us that when shoppers start reading labels, the market responds. That's why Jason's is important, not because it's perfect, but because it proves the old model is not the only model. Verdict? One of the strongest mainstream supermarket options if your priority is a shorter, more recognisable ingredient list. So what's the real problem here? At this point, I think it's important to say what this video is not arguing. This is not a banned chemicals story. This is not a Britain is feeding people illegal bread story. And this is not a panic story. The real story is subtler and honestly more useful. The story is that a huge part of the bread aisle has become so industrially normal that shoppers barely notice it anymore. The front says family, bakery, heritage, rustic, freshly baked, and the back says preservative, emulsifier, stabilizer, treatment agent, shelf life system. That gap is the story. Not one scary ingredient, the gap. So, what should you actually buy? So let's make this practical. I'm not going to tell you to throw out your bread. That would be ridiculous. People are busy. People are on budgets. People buy what their household will actually eat. So here's the useful version. A simpler loaf usually looks something like this. Flour, water, salt, yeast or sourdough starter, maybe seeds or grains. A more industrial loaf often includes calcium propionate, E471, E472e, E481, soya flour, multiple oils, longer formulation-style ingredient lists. That doesn't mean you can never buy it. It means buy it knowingly. 3 rules that make this whole aisle easier. Rule 1. If a loaf says no artificial preservatives, do not assume that means additive-free. Check for emulsifiers. Rule 2. If a loaf says sourdough, make the back of the packet prove it. Sure to list, good sign. Long industrial list, be skeptical. Rule 3. If a brand sells you heritage, warmth, family tradition or rustic baking, remember this. A founding date is not an ingredient list. So, after looking through the aisle, here's the simplest summary. If you want the classic industrial loaf model, Warburtons, Hovis, Kingsmill and Roberts all show variations of the same broad system. If you want a cleaner mainstream direction, Jackson's looks more promising than many of the big standard wrapped loaves, but still read the label. If you want one of the clearest mainstream supermarket upgrades, Jason's stands out strongly on ingredient simplicity. And if you're shopping own label or bakery style supermarket bread, don't let words like freshly baked, rustic or sourdough do all the thinking for you. So, what did we actually find? Not poison, not banned ingredients, not a grand conspiracy.
We found something quieter than that, and probably more common. We found that industrial bread has become so ordinary in Britain that many shoppers no longer recognise it as industrial. The front sells a mood. The back explains the product. And if there's one thing I want this episode to change, it's that. Because once you start reading the back of the packet, you realise the bread aisle is not as simple as it looks. Some breads are genuinely closer to bread in the old-fashioned sense. Some are much more engineered than the packaging suggests, and most of the time the difference is not hidden. It's printed right there. You just have to turn the loaf around. That's Aisle Alert. Keep your eyes on the aisle. If this helped you shop smarter, hit like. If YouTube shows you the hype button, use that too. Subscribe if you want more evidence-led investigations into the products sitting in your trolley every week. And comment below with the next aisle you want me to investigate, because there's a lot more hiding in plain sight.